What's up, everybody? I'm Emerald, and this is the Emerald Crusader live stream. Welcome back. What's up, Nick? Wore Green Lantern shirt yesterday, not even thinking of Willpower Wednesday. Nice. Regardless of whether or not it was subliminal or chance. I love it. Yeah, Mandy, as an early anniversary present, gave me a Green Lantern shirt that I will be wearing next Wednesday on Willpower Wednesday. on purpose, very much so, not on chance. But that will be next Wednesday. Today is Thursday, which means it is time for yet another installment of Thoughtful Thursday. So for anyone new watching, oh yeah, I mean, she also got me this guy, which it has cold water in it now, but it's one of those mugs that change with temperature. So tomorrow when I do Chai Friday and I have a hot chai tea in there, you'll see the whole Green Lantern army in the back there. So yeah, anything Green Lantern, I'll probably love it. But yeah, so for anyone who's never seen the stream before, Thoughtful Thursday is where I do a couple of different segments meant to inspire thought and provoke curiosity in myself and others. So with that being our goal, let's wet our thought palette. Let's wet our whistle on some historical events that took place on this date, not this year, but January 21st. So in 1790, Joseph Guillotine invented the guillotine, which was then seen as a more humane form of execution. And then in a cruel twist of irony, Louis XVI, also on the same date, the date of its inception, the last king of Bourbon King of France, was executed by guillotine, probably the most famous execution by guillotine ever, in Paris after being found guilty of crimes against the state during the French Revolution. Also on this date, in 1903, Harry Houdini escaped from a police station in Amsterdam. They still aren't sure quite how he did it. 1977, then U.S. President Jimmy Carter pardons almost all Vietnam War draft evaders. And it was a unprecedented, huge pardon that had never really happened since Abraham Lincoln kind of era. So just with some things going on in the news, I thought that was an interesting thing that took place today. In 1978, the Bee Gees album was There's No Way to Get Ahead in Life. Yeah, very true. Bee Gees album Saturday Night Fever goes #1 for the 24th week today. Also on January 21st in 2010, the late great LA Lakers forward Kobe Bryant becomes the youngest NBA player in history to reach 25,000 career points at 31 years old, beating in just 151 days, beating out Wilt the Stilt Chamberlain by an entire 35 days. So he was able to get there over a month faster as far as career days goes. And then in our most recent history, on this day in 2020, was the first cases of the coronavirus reported in the United States. So it's been a year since COVID first touched down and changed how we pretty much live life until we get those vaccines rolling out to just about everyone. So yeah, it's been a fun year. So with that said, and me not really having any segues planned, let's just roll right into the next thing and talk about something in history that didn't happen on this day. So when you say the words tidal wave of beer, some might get excited about that. Someone might say, oh, it'd be a dream come true. But be careful what you wish for, because it turns out that a tidal wave of beer isn't quite as fun as you'd think it would be. So, in 1810, one of the two largest breweries in London had bought the Horseshoe Brewery, which was in a densely populated slum in London. To keep up with the very high demand for beer at the time, they built a huge 22-foot high wooden fermentation tank that was held together with cast iron bands and capable of holding 3,500 barrels, weighing the equivalent of 33 tons. So, if you remember from yesterday's story, that's more beer than Rock's Dashrath moved. He moved like 23 tons. This is 33 tons of beer. So it's a lot of beer. So by 1814, the cast iron rings holding the barrels together started to corrode, and on October 17th of that year, the store clerk noticed that the iron bands securing the vat began to slip off and warned his supervisor, who shrugged it off and told the clerk no harm whatever would ensue. And he was kind of wrong about that. At 4:30, one of the cast iron bands snapped and the barrel started to buckle tremendously. And then, about an hour later in that day, happens what we're here to talk about and the title of the card next to me. It's called the London Beer Flood, but I thought the Brunami of 1814 sounded way better, so. About an hour later, at 5:30 p.m., the barrel gave way, unleashing a wave of beer so strong that it smashed through a wall that was 2.5 bricks thick. And it smashed through it so hard that it threw chunks of brick into the roofs of the surrounding buildings and houses. And this wave also hit the other fermentation tanks with such force that it broke all of those tanks as well. So after breaking all of those tanks, the end result is a tidal wave made of around 320,000 gallons of beer that was reported to reach its peak of just over 15 feet high. Tragically, the London beer flood did result in some huge human casualties, 8 in total, which it actually makes the London beer flood more lethal than the Great Fire of London that killed 6 people. These are estimated totals, as records aren't great. But that the deaths and the chaos caused by the tidal wave did not stop hundreds of Londoners from flocking to the streets to take advantage of all the free booze. There actually is a claim that there was a 9th death reported from the London beer flood that wasn't from drowning or anything like that, but was actually from alcohol poisoning from someone over consuming the beer that came in the form of a tidal wave. So, I mean, people were running out with huge mason jars and everything like that, while other people were like there was a pub nearby that just like got completely destroyed, and I think a barmaid there was one of the deaths. So you have that happening, and then everyone's like, wait, there's beer everywhere. We're not just gonna let this go to waste. I mean, they were reportedly just like straight up drinking it out of puddles. So yeah. After that, they started a prohibition against using wooden vats for a very good reason, as this was a huge catastrophe in London's history, although one of the weirder ones. And so they started forcing brewers to use concrete vats instead, just because they were more sturdy. And speaking of being forced to use things that are stronger and not having very strong segues, let's go to the next segment, where we talk about technology. So this isn't really a breaking technology, but it's being used in some very interesting ways in new tech. So what we're going to talk about today is tensegrity structures. So tensegrity structures, also known as tensional integrity structures or floating compression structures, they're based on a structural principle based on a system of isolated components under pressure. In the picture, it would be the popsicle sticks, and then those float inside a network of continuous tension, in the picture, the strings. And they're arranged in such a way that the compressed members do not touch each other, while the pre-stress tension members, usually cables or tendons, delineate the system spatially. The term was coined by American architect Buckminster Fuller in the 1960s as a portmanteau of tensional and integrity. The other denomination of tensegrity, floating compression, was coined by a constructive artist named Kenneth Snelson. And I just think his last name's really funny. Snelson. Anyway, he's actually a really cool artist and does really awesome stuff. But let's break that down a little bit more plainly. So to put it in other words, you need a minimum of 2 hard pieces that maintain their shape and do not touch each other, and they're only joined by the points where the tension components link them. So as an example, looking at the GIF in the picture here, the top and the bottom of the table do not touch each other except for the wires connecting them. So Steve Mudd has a video explaining tensegrity on YouTube, which heavily informed this segment that I'm currently going through. And in that video, he breaks down a further explanation of tensegrity in a 2D form. So let's take a quick look at his video just to explain what it is visually.
So here's the 2D version, and I've built it with elastic bands instead of wires because I want you to see how they bend and stretch when you try to collapse the structure. So why is this structure stable? Well, any way that you try to collapse the structure, it turns out that at least one of the elastic bands ends up being stretched. And when you stretch an elastic band, it pulls back. So for example, when I try and collapse the structure in this direction, this elastic band stretches and it restores the structure back to its equilibrium position. And we can look at individual elastic bands. For example, if we try to keep this elastic band and this elastic band the same length and try to collapse the structure, what would happen? Well, we need to sort of do this, something like that. And of course, in doing so, we're stretching this elastic band. Similarly, if we try to keep these 2 elastic bands the same length, we're trying to collapse the structure, this one is stretching. Or if we try to keep these 2 the same length, we'd end up doing something like that, wouldn't we? Or something like that. And so the middle elastic band stretches. So hopefully, just by inspection, you can see that no matter how you try and distort this tensegrity structure, the stretching of the elastic bands will restore it back to its equilibrium position. Just to hammer the point home, I've replaced 2 of the elastic bands with string, so we really can't stretch these ones now. And look, we don't have that much freedom of movement. I can do that, and I can do that, and either direction that I go in, the elastic band ends up stretching. A 2D tensegrity structure.
So I thought that was a really good visual demonstration of how tensegrity structures work, but his demonstration of a 2D form doesn't really completely represent the 3D form, as in the 3D world it has to have 3 points of contact, including the contact point in the middle. Kind of think about how a stool can't stand without at least 3 legs. It's kind of the same concept. And there are ones with 2 points that actually exist, but their center of gravity is on the wrong side in order for them to stay. So if you put any weight off of them, they kind of fall apart. So they're not really considered true tensegrity structures. This one in the GIF is, because if you look at it, even though it does have motion going from side to side whenever it's tapped, still has tremendous, it's still tremendously sturdy if you put downward force on the very top of the table there. And actually, in this GIF, it's a very good demonstration of what Steve was showing us in 2D, because you can look and see the one side stretching and the other side giving in a little bit, allowing it to move to one side, and then the tension eventually pulls them back to their original resting position. So, although the name Tensegrity was coined in the 60s, the concept has actually been around for quite some time. Actually, possibly longer than we have. So, Tensegrity. Let's talk about it. It is a structural principle that describes a relationship between every part of the organism and the mechanical system that integrates them into a complete functional unit. Put simply, it is our bodies and the bodies of many other species relying on the structural principles of tensegrity to carry out our daily functions. Our bones essentially act as the compressed parts, the hard parts of the tensegrity structure, and our muscles and ligaments and tendons act as the parts under tension. So there's certain areas of the human body and many other bodies based on a internal skeletal structure has many tensegrity structures all throughout it. This is theorized to be the case because tensegrity structures are often more efficient at using less materials to obtain more strength, therefore being lighter, and the natural process of evolution often opting for things that are lighter and stronger inevitably exploited the principle of tensegrity. But nature isn't the only thing exploiting the principle of tensegrity. The architectural field has adopted the concept, probably most famously in, I'm going to butcher this name even though I practice it, Kurilpa. Actually, I think I nailed it. Bridge in Brisbane, in Australia. In October of 2009, a reporter did an interview there with the architect, and I just want to listen to a little snippet of him describing the bridge.
But not just a new landmark, Kurilpa Bridge is a historical feat. The unique design is the first of its kind in the world. A combination of tension and compression keeps the bridge upright.
You'll notice that most of the masts or struts don't touch each other, and so they're being really supported by the cables that are stretching them apart.
The design already turning heads overseas.
So he just described it. It's exactly what a tensegrity structure is. He just said the spindles and masts and whatever you want to call them are individually suspended from each other, and it's a combination of the tension and the compression keeping the structure together. So that's a really, really cool looking bridge, and it's set to be adopted by many other countries very soon, even though this was 10 years ago. But there are other fields that are experimenting with the concept of tensegrity. And I think the coolest example of this is NASA's Tensegrity robot. So because of its lightweight and strength, NASA engineers thought this type of structure could be the way to go when it comes to interplanetary exploration. Not only could it sustain heavy impact and ultimately maintain its original shape, but it could protect a payload in the center of that structure and protect it from that impact as well. And also, they've developed a way for it to move by manipulating the length of the wires with motors and pulleys. They can move the poles in such a way that the rover rolls itself. But let's watch a quick video of one of the guys that developed the rover, explaining how they came up with the concept and talking about it a little bit further.
So the initial inspiration was you took one of these toys and we said, what can we use this for? Well, they make them as baby toys because they're really safe. It's hard to break them, hard to hurt yourself with it, hard for a baby to hurt themselves with it. And you can throw it on the ground really hard, you're not gonna break it. And we're like, hey, that's a landing robot. We're using tensegrity structures, which are these tensile networks that are very shock absorbent and compliant. And we're using those to build robots or planetary landers that can land on another planet, absorb that impact shock, and then that very same structure is your robot that enables mobility on the planetary surface. So why, as engineers, would we care about these types of structures? As you interact with the environment and you have different forms of interactions, I want to pick something up, I want to walk across different terrains, the stiffness of your structure ends up having a very direct impact on your efficiency, your effectiveness, how you respond to things. And so being able to tune that stiffness and either make it stiffer or floppier is one of the sort of holy grails of modern robotics. And these types of structures enable that by changing the overall tension of the structure. You can turn it from being very stiff to being very floppy. This is one of the first mobile prototypes that we built, and it was really designed for motion, and you can just sort of see how robust it is. We can eventually suspend a reasonable mission-relevant payload in the middle. The real challenge here is we've broken all the rules of traditional robotics designs. A lot of those design approaches just don't work with this robot. How do you sense its shape? How do you sense its forces? How do you actually actuate and control it? How do you have power and information communicated through this whole structure? And so just that sort of basic engineering principles is a big part of what the research we had to do is. Tensegrity robots is a fascinating new direction for robotics in general. There's really interesting properties here to unlock, but it's a hard problem.
So yeah, that's super duper cool. At least I thought so. I mean, it's been a concept that's been around for the better part of a century, but it's only really, especially in places like robotics and architecture, really starting to be played with. And I know that it's used for a lot of really cool art designs and things like that, but I would be interested in seeing how else it could be used in real world applications, other than just making awesome looking art. But that is the NASA rover, and that is Tensegrity structures. Super duper cool. And so let's move on to our next segment, where we talk about a really smart person. So this really smart person this week is a gentleman by the name of Dr. Harold Varmus. He is an American Nobel Prize winning scientist who was director of the NIH from 1993 to 1999 and the 14th director of the National Cancer Institute from 2010 to 2015. He was a co-recipient, along with J. Michael Bishop, of the 1989 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery of the cellular origin of retroviral oncogenes. During the course of his years of research at UCSF from 1970 to 1993, Varmus's scientific work was focused principally on the mechanisms by which retroviruses replicate, cause cancer in animals, and produce cancer-like changes to cultured cells. The discovery he and Bishop made triggered the identification of many cellular proto-oncogenes for mutations that drive human cancers. So he and his partner Bishop did so much to advance how to identify what might become cancerous. I mean, they've advanced the field of cancer research by so much, it's amazing. He, in addition to winning the Nobel Prize, he also won the Double Helix Medal in 2011 and the National Medal of Science in 2001. He has authored over 300 scientific papers, 5 books, including The Art and Politics of Science. While his research and the work he has contributed is amazing. I mean, 300 scientific papers is ridiculous, on top of 5 books, on top of a revolutionary breakthrough in a field that is one of the leading causes of death around the globe. While looking into him, I found an interview with him talking about how he became a scientist in the first place. And I think I would like to end the stream with this interview. It is 7 minutes long, but for some reasons that he lays out not only at the beginning of the interview, but also at the end, I think this video is very fitting to end a stream that's aim is to inspire thought and curiosity. But before I do that, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. If you like this, I will be back next Thursday for another Thoughtful Thursday. If you really like this, I also go live 4 other nights a week at 7:30. So come back for Chai Friday tomorrow, which is my book club. I will be wrapping up part 2 of Stephen King. So if you've read the book, or if you're able to catch up through part 2 by 7:30 tomorrow, come join me. Or if you're behind, you can always watch the video later on YouTube. But if you haven't read it, I would not recommend watching it because there will be a lot of spoilers. Then on Saturday, we do Weekend Deep End, which is a half-hour deep dive into something that I find interesting. Music Monday, I've got a couple of different segments where I do band suggestions. Center Stage, where I do a deep dive about a band or an artist or something like that. And then I talk about weird and crazy instruments. Then I'll be back on Willpower Wednesday for a deep dive into a story of someone with a lot of or demonstrating an amazing feat of will to hopefully inspire will in myself and others. And so if any of that sounds cool to you, come join me at 7:30, and thanks for joining me tonight. And with that said, take it away, Dr. Varmus.
I'm Harold Varmus. I'm a cancer biologist, and I'm the president of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how somebody becomes a scientist. Many people think that scientists are born, and they're born with special properties. They listen to Mozart in the crib, they excel at math even in grade school, they join the chess club, they don't do athletics, they end up being victors in science fairs before they get to college, and they enter a track that leads to advanced degrees in science and engineering. And of course, this sometimes happens and reinforces the popular image. But there are lots of ways to become a scientist, and it's important at a time when the US is losing numbers of scientists and not training enough to sustain our leadership in industry and the sciences, to think about other ways in which people do become scientists. I had myself an unusual route to being a scientist, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time telling you about what that route was like. So I was a good but not exceptional student in public high schools in Freeport, New York on Long Island. I didn't have strong science teachers. I didn't show any particular interest in science. I didn't spend my afternoons with a chemistry set. I spent more of them playing tennis and going to the beach or reading novels than I did attempting to win science fairs. My father was a doctor, and I expected to follow him into medicine. And after high school, went off to Amherst College as a pre-medical student. And there at Amherst, placed before me was a very rich table of intellectual opportunities in physics and philosophy and literature and history. And I found myself spending most of my time running the college newspaper and doing a thesis on Charles Dickens and spending time with my literary friends. I continued to think about medical school, but didn't do particularly well in chemistry, and decided finally to go off to graduate school in English literature, where I spent a year before deciding again to think about medical school. And after being rejected by one, Harvard, I chose to go to another, Columbia, and found myself engrossed in sequence, in psychiatry, and then internal medicine, never paying much attention to serious laboratory research, but interested in other serious forms of research in the clinic, but not really engaged in any of those forms. I did house staff training, and then at the age of 28, the Vietnam War required that I make a decision about a way to serve my country without serving a war I didn't believe in. I was able to do that thanks to a program that allowed those of us who were dissenters from the war to work at the National Institutes of Health. And here, for reasons that beyond this discussion, I was plunged into work on the molecular biology of E. coli, the way in which bacteria regulate expression of a set of genes called the lac operon. This exposed me for the first time to the excitement of laboratory research. I was a lot older than most students who write to me today to work on an Intel project in my laboratory at Sloan Kettering, but nevertheless, I still had the same kind of enthusiasm I see in those high school students for understanding how a bacterial organism controls its genes. Molecular biology was in its early phases. The idea of using bacteria or other simple organisms as model organisms for understanding higher levels of regulation in complex organisms was still, again, at its early stages. And this was an exhilarating time, but it's not something I had been trained for. And I wanted to get back to something that was more medically related, which I did when I discovered through coursework at the NIH that there was new excitement about viruses, very small packets of genes that were able to turn a normal cell into a cancer cell. Cancer was an important and is an important human disease I was interested in trying to understand with the new tools of molecular biology. And at that point, at the age of 30, I came to the University of California, San Francisco to begin what proved to be over 2 decades of work on how cancer viruses grow and how they turn a normal cell into a cancer cell. The reason I tell this story is to illustrate that there are lots of ways to become a scientist, and that in the US, one of the great advantages we have is that we don't require that people make career decisions at an early age. We even encourage what I would call a prolonged adolescence. This is something to keep in mind as you progress through high school and college. There is still time to make decisions about the way you're going to conduct your careers. Moreover, it's important to remember that not every scientist is a math whiz as a grade school student, that there are lots of ways to become a scientist and lots of ways to be a scientist. In fact, I would argue that while science can involve experimental procedures and analysis of classical experiments, there are lots of other ways to think like a scientist, even in fields that are outside of what we call the conventional natural sciences. So thinking like a scientist means thinking about evidence, gathering it, evaluating it, and interpreting it in a way that helps to make sense of the world in which we live. We need more of this in our world, and it's with an effort to understand that there are lots of paths to developing a scientific outlook that can influence your career and help strengthen our society that I offer this brief story of an unconventional way to become a scientist.